This is Brandeis University.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lisa Lynch, the Dean of the Heller School for Social Policy and Management. And on behalf of Brandeis University and the Heller School, I want to welcome you to this very special symposium, Paths to Compassionate Action and Service. As you know, this is a symposium honoring Professor Larry Simon's 40 years of action and service in development. And when we were sort of planning this event and what we could do to sort of honor Larry, I said there's nothing better than organizing a symposium and bringing together individuals who you've touched their lives, they have touched your life, and sort of celebrate the process of engaging in compassionate action and service. I want to bring greetings from President Fred Lawrence from Brandeis University, who wished he could have been here, but he's currently in India, actually meeting with Heller students, so we're very happy about that. I want to acknowledge some very special guests that are here today. Neela and Ravi, Larry's wife and son, and I know that I'm speaking on behalf of everybody at Heller and Brandeis. Thank you for sharing Larry with us. I suspect there are many nights where you wish he was home as opposed to being with us, but we also know how much your family together engages in the issues that we're going to be thinking about and talking about today. So welcome. I also want to welcome our Heller board members, Mo Feldman and his wife Susan, and David Squire, and Ronnie Zinner, who are here with us. I don't know, I'm looking around to see if I got some other board members here, and we hope that we'll be joined as well by Provost Steve Goldstein and former Provost Irv Epstein. But the other groups of people that I want to welcome here today are Larry's friends and colleagues, and I have to say, most importantly, Larry's students. So how about a round of applause for all those students here? Before I turn the microphone over to the panel discussion, I just wanted to give a little bit of introduction about Larry and to sort of help set why we're having this discussion this afternoon. As you know, Larry is a professor at the Heller School and executive director of our programs in sustainable international development. He received his bachelor's at Queens College and his MA and PhD at Clark University. He's been an anti-poverty worker in Sri Lanka, his senior advisor on global poverty to the Google Foundation, the author of an expose on U.S. finance land reform in El Salvador that led to a New York Times investigation and prompted congressional hearings. Larry really epitomized the scholar activist, and he has been engaged in all parts of the world in terms of making a difference for the most vulnerable individuals and populations. His accomplishments in the field of international sustainable development are numerous, but I just wanted to highlight a few things that Larry has done here at Brandeis. As you know, or you should know, Larry is really the visionary founder of our programs on sustainable international development. And the story of how that happened is kind of, I think, only at Brandeis something like this could happen. He was in Sri Lanka working for the United Nations Development Program when we were arguing at lunch if it was a fax or a telex. We're not quite sure which technology was. Today it would be a tweet probably, but he got a fax from Irv Epstein, who at that stage was the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Brandeis. And he asked Larry whether or not he could take over the course load of the professor of politics, Ruth Morgenthau, who I suspect some of you in this room may have known, who was going on medical leave. Now, Larry had in his mind, and I can tell you as his colleague, his mind is always working. He's always thinking about the next project. But he had already in his mind the idea of a program in sustainable international development. And while he was teaching these courses, he spent his time convincing Morgenthau, then Epstein, and Provost, at that stage Provost, and then became President, Yehuda Reinhartz. So we had the origins of the program in Sustainable International Development. The program started with 6 students. The second year there were 12. 9 of them were funded by the Fulbright Foundation. They were Fulbright scholars. And on the basis of that growth, that doubling in growth, the Brandeis administration decided that this was a program that had some legs and ramped the program up from there. So it was initially based in the politics department and then moved to the Heller School for Social Policy and Management. We now have graduates in the Masters of Arts in Sustainable International Development, a Master of Science in International Health Policy and Management, and students who have graduated with a dual degree in Sustainable International Development and Coexistence and Conflict. We're up to 1,500 alums from these programs. Going to come a long way, Larry, from that first class of 6. Our current students come from more than 60 countries. Our incoming class, each year we're bringing in about 150 to 170 students. When I say 170, Larry gets a little paler because he's thinking, what are we going to do with all these students? But the demand for this program, I think, speaks volume to how Larry and his colleagues have really created an innovative program that matches theory and practice and has a very unique approach to thinking about the issue of sustainable international development. And I count myself fortunate to be one of the faculty members in the Sustainable International Development Program and to have Larry as my program head. I thought it would be helpful for you to know a little bit about some of those students that have graduated from these programs, because they really epitomize today's notion, the conference's theme of compassionate service and action. We have over about 2/3 of our students come from outside of the United States. Many of them are employed in international organizations, and I think even more importantly, most of them return to their home countries. And our U.S. students who are involved in the program, many of them have had experience outside of the United States before they come into the program, and then are just eager to go back out, either in the U.S. or outside of the U.S. to put in practice the skills that they've developed through the program. Our students, our graduates have been employed by UNDP, UNICEF, USAID. I have to, knowing who's here in the audience, various Oxfams, the World Bank, Save the Children, et cetera. And many of our graduates have gone on to do a PhD. Let me just give you a couple of examples of some of our recent graduates. Akiko Mira, who received her MA in 2005, is now the executive director of Oxfam Japan, and she played a pivotal role in tapping overseas partnerships to assist Japan following last year's earthquake and tsunami. Some of the lessons she took from Heller, and I'm quoting from her, there are no boundaries in disasters. Now is the time to put people together, those who work in disasters and those who work to fight against poverty. I believe this will result in better reconstruction efforts and a better sustainable future for all. Cedric Schuster received a master's in 1999, was elected in March 2011 to the Samoa Parliament for a 5-year term. He's a member of the opposition party and spokesperson for the environment. He owns a small environmental consultancy based in Samoa, serves as Pacific coordinator for the advisor board of Global Green Grants Fund, etc. And finally, Rhonda Huhouse, who's again got the master's in 1999, is a policy analyst for government affairs at the Disability Rights Education Defense Fund in Washington, D.C., doing advocacy work in the area of civil rights for persons with disabilities. We have a motto at Hellard, and our motto is knowledge advancing social justice. And I think you could tell from those three students, these students have taken that knowledge and they have put it into practice to advance social justice. But they were able to acquire that knowledge in a very unique program that was the vision of Larry and the output of many of his colleagues that are here in this room today. And I just have to say, Larry, we are so grateful that you brought this here to Brandeis. I can't think of a better place to have brought this vision. And you have really done an extraordinary job through this program of really making some inroads in repairing the world. So thank you very much. I'll now turn to Raj Sampath.
Thank you, Lisa, for those gracious welcoming remarks. I'd like to welcome everybody to our symposium, Compassionate Action and Service, honoring 40 years of service to world development by Professor Lawrence Simon. Excuse me, in 2 years, having moved out from California, I've never gotten a cold. And on the eve of this event, Murphy's Law, I have a slight sore throat, so I'll do my best to enunciate. Having gotten to know Larry over the last few years, and as Lisa mentioned, the lives he's touched and lives that he's been touched by, I was really struck and flattered and honored to be asked to moderator of this event. Larry's compassion and action, as I'll speak to briefly as I begin the introductions of our speakers and respondents, is truly something remarkable, and I think our speakers will attest to that by reflecting on their own lives. I'm reminded by the great rabbi and theologian of the 20th century, Rabbi Heschel, Abraham Joshua Heschel. He famously remarked that on the marches with Dr. Martin Luther King, he said every step was like a prayer. If you take a step back and reflect on that statement, it's awesome mystery as to what he was pointing to. The passion for justice, the outward passion for justice, does come from some internal source in all of our being. The internal cry that comes with every prayer for restoration and wholeness is typically a private matter. His genius was to suggest that in action, in taking a step, the two can come together. And I thought that could be a little principle to organize today's conference and event. It embodies compassion in action, and I think it's a great way to introduce a symposium to honor Larry Simon. So today we honor Dr. Lawrence Simon of Compassion, Action, and Service. We'll hear from several truly unique individuals on this panel, a remarkable set of individuals honoring a remarkable man. Each from their own vantage point will offer their own personal reflections on their lives, the sources of compassion that they drew from, and how they undertook their journeys to pursue social justice, one step at a time, like Heschel. So without further ado, I know we have a long agenda, and I thank you for your patience today. We're going to begin with a video from an old friend of Larry Brilliant, Larry Simon, excuse me. Two Larrys. I worked for both of them, one in the past and the current one. So an old friend of Larry Simon is Dr. Larry Brilliant, MD, as Lisa had mentioned. And I don't want to recapitulate the biographies that are in the handouts. You have that. I'll say one thing. Larry Brilliant is compassion as action, par excellence. And you're going to see that in his personality. It exudes even through a video. So if we can begin the video, we'll start the symposium. Thank you.
I wish I was with you. My wife, Geertje, wishes that she was able to join. We would do anything, go anywhere honor Larry Simon. Let me tell you a little bit about Larry that you don't already know. He may want to walk out of the room right now. His face is going to turn red. He's going to get embarrassed. But my wife and I lived in India for 10 years. We worked to help eradicate smallpox. Smallpox is the only disease so far eradicated. I hope soon polio will join that list. After we eradicated smallpox, my wife George and I came back to Ann Arbor, Michigan. I became a professor. She got her PhD. And we became, Larry, I'm sorry to say this, bored being an academe, and we wanted to do something more active. We started with the idea that if we got all the veterans of the smallpox eradication program together, or as many as we could, we would start and tackle another disease. So we formed something called the SEVA Foundation. Steve Jobs gave us our original money. And we called together friends who wanted to experience the same feeling we had, the great gift that we had when we were able to participate in eradicating smallpox. We had our first meeting in Michigan. We debated what to do. We decided we would go and try to tackle needless blindness. And thus began the SEVA Foundation's now 30-plus years of working on fighting blindness. SEVA's projects have given back sight to more than 3 million blind people. But very early on, we didn't know what to do. We were used to an organization where everybody had a PhD or had been a professor at some Soviet school and were on deputation to the UN. But we wanted to make this a voluntary organization so that lots of other people could join in that work. We only had one model, and that was Oxfam. And with a great deal of nervousness, I called Oxfam and wanted to talk to anybody who would give us advice, and I found Larry Simon. Larry not only gave us advice, he flew to Ann Arbor, he coached us. Sitting on the couch in my house, he talked about how Oxfam had started from the Oxford Famine Relief Organization, how it began with the wives and family of Dons at Oxford gathering used clothes for the Greek and then Biafran famine. But this was an amazing guy to be sitting in my living room. He had so much love and so much respect for people who were poor and vulnerable. That's not always the way it is in the UN. We're working on poverty as a clinical activity, not a heartfelt activity. I think I learned more from Larry Simon that one evening in our house than I had learned working in the UN for 10 years. Because he put people first at the center of all the work that he did. The philosophy and the mechanics and the theories of development change, those were all secondary. It was the people who were first. And so Larry and I began a relationship. He was my mentor. He was somebody I could call and think through what we would do when SEVA began a relationship with the United Nations. I could call Larry and get his advice. And about 4 or 5 years later, Larry called me, and he said that Elie Wiesel and Larry Phillips and he were starting this new organization, American Jewish World Service. And he asked me if I would be on its board. And it was modeled after the American Friends Service Organization, the Quaker organization, which had played such an instrumental and important role in the fight against the war in Vietnam. Their nonviolence had been a great inspiration. And here's the American Jewish World Service. And Larry had these wonderful ideas of an organization that was funded by Jewish philanthropy, but was decidedly working with other than Jews to show the kind of tikkun olam, this spirit of healing the broken world, extending beyond the Jewish community. And I was absolutely entranced, and I signed up as fast as I could. Then I got to watch Larry do what I had do at SEVA, try to build an organization, recruit staff, enthuse them with the right values and skills, and work with a board of directors. It was a wonderful experience. That was just the beginning of our relationship. When I was at Google, running Google Philanthropy, Larry came and spent a year as part of his sabbatical, coaching my new hires on what it meant to work in the world of philanthropy. They had no experience. They were largely engineers. Larry's son has come to work at the Seva Foundation. It's like full circle for me, and having Aaron is just absolute delight. Now I'm at the Skoll Global Threats Fund, and I work with some of the worst things in the world: climate change, nuclear proliferation, the war, conflict in Israel and Palestine, the Middle East. We work on water shortages and pandemics. And Larry is a constant advisor to me as I try to think through the strategy and the tactics, and a very dear friend. Larry, there's nobody I'd rather be saying this about. It is an honor for me to be part of any event that honors you, my friend. God bless you. Thank you for all the work that you've done. Good luck in what you're going to do for all the rest of us now. And give me a call. I'd love to hear from you. Bye.
Apparently the two Larrys have a history of calling each other in times of need and responding appropriately. Now I must say what an honor it is to introduce our keynote for the symposium, Professor Rabbi Irving Yitz Greenberg. I think Professor Stephen Katz at Boston University said it best. To quote him, "No Jewish thinker has had a greater impact on the American Jewish community in the last 2 decades than Irving Yitz Greenberg." Rabbi Greenberg's decades of thought, action, and contribution cannot be distilled in a few words without doing them grave injustice. They are too vast and too profound. All I can say is that we are all truly humbled and grateful for your keynote at the symposium honoring Larry Simon. Without further ado, please welcome Rabbi Yitz Greenberg.
I want to say that I feel privileged to be part of this symposium, which is in honor of Larry's 40 years of service. Obviously, the privilege is in part because of the extraordinary distinction of his record and of this program itself. But I also will add a personal side. It gives me a chance to say 2 things publicly that have been on my mind probably for at least 40 years, or at least the beginning of HAWS, which is about 35 years, I guess. Number one is that I was a member of the board, one of the number of members of the board, who tried very hard to mediate and enable Larry to continue the leadership of AJWS, but failed. I felt then, and I feel now, I think it's recognized now, that it was his vision and his execution and his imagination and drive that enabled the World Service to come into existence. And so in a certain sense, I've always looked back and I'm really happy and proud now, number one, that the organization has grown enormously under the outstanding leadership of Ruth, and that it has matured to the point where it can acknowledge and celebrate your indispensable contribution to its beginning. The second reason I'll say publicly is because the impact upon me when it was created. It was electrifying because I felt I was encountering the deepest, or one of the deepest core themes, messages of my religion that was really the core of its meaning for the world, not just for the Jews, but something that had really not had proper attention or role for millennia, literally. And therefore I sort of felt it was like to be present at the birth of historic restoration was very electrifying for me personally. So let me perhaps try to explain that a little more by going back to the core message and why it moved me so much to see this incarnation of that message. What is the core message of Judaism? I would argue it is the vision and the promise, the commitment of Tikkun Olam, which is a world repaired and perfected, indeed made into a perfect world. Tikkun Olam has become a cliche of modern Jewish theology, and everybody, it's like motherhood and apple pie in American culture. No one would dare argue with it. But I think it's not fully and properly understood. In many ways, the major impact of Judaism is not just through itself, but this message of not accepting the world as it is, not accepting or yielding to the status quo, go fight City Hall, it'll never change anyway, but really that it can and must be transformed. Not to surrender, but in some sense a promise that if you try, this is not Don Quixote, this is not an impossible mission. If you start and try, you have a promise that the goal, nothing less than perfection, will be achieved. Now, what's the definition of that perfection that we would like to believe could be achieved? And bluntly, again, the Jewish tradition starts at a very extreme, perhaps, position. It's really a dream of a paradise. Nothing less than a Garden of Eden on this planet. Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, who was a teacher of mine, a teacher of Rabbi Mark Gopin, argues that this, in fact, is why the Torah, the Bible, the fundamental document of Judaism, starts not, if you thought the Torah as a code of law or of behavior for Jews, it should start with the first laws, but that doesn't come till the middle of the second book of the Bible. If you think that it's really the history and the narrative of the Jewish people, then it should start with the first Jew, Abraham and Sarah. That doesn't come till the 12th chapter of Genesis. It starts with the first moment of creation, because he argues what Judaism is about, what its dream is, the completion and perfection of creation, and nothing less. The most fervent desire, he describes, of the religious man is to behold the replenishment of the deficiency in creation, when the real world will conform to the ideal world. The idea of creation is the central idea. It is the importance of human as a partner with the Almighty in the act of creation, in which mortal man can repair the flaws of this world and perfect it. Well, what does that mean? Again, I understand there are flaws. What are they? What's the criteria? What do we seek to achieve in perfection? So I start again with the creation story. I think the core verse there is the statement that every human being is created in the image of God. Or, to use the language of Genesis, the Lord created the human in God's image. In the image of God, God created them. Man and woman, God created them. The Talmud gives us a definition of what does it mean to be an image of God. Every human being is born in the image of God. But what does it mean? In essence, what it says is there are three fundamental dignities that have nothing to do with birth, with skin color, with gender, with sexual orientation, with citizenship, but by dint of being born a human being, if that is recognized, you will discover that these are the three fundamental dignities. The first comes to be somewhat well known. If you save one life, it's like saving a whole world. Now, I often reflected on that. What does that mean? One person is the equivalent of 6 billion, 400 million and counting. The answer obviously is yes, there is one way in which that's true. If you see each person as infinitely valuable, then to save one infinity is equivalent to saving 6 billion infinities. Again, infinite value sounds like a lovely, wonderful cliche. What does it mean? But concretely, when you start thinking about it, what it means is if you are infinitely valuable, it's worth spending millions of dollars just to save your life. It means that as a society, you have an obligation to make sure that you don't lack for the thousands of dollars of a premium for medical insurance, without which you will pass up treatment or you may even die. It means, to bring it to Brandeis, that I would spend thousands of dollars a year in tuition just to improve your mind, because you're totally you're infinitely valuable. Therefore, the margin of improvement of your mind is worth thousands of dollars a year. And one could go on and on. Perhaps I can dramatize it this way. An infinite value is the criterion for an image of God. Well, what's the image of man? What's the most valuable image of man ever created? This is a matter of public record, as I'm sure many of you are aware of. The most expensive work of art ever sold, at least a matter of public record, is a painting by Gustav Klimt. It's an image of man, literally, created by a man, and it is of a woman, actually, and a Jewish philanthropist, actually, paid $135 million for this painting. If you watch the papers in the last 2 years, a Picasso sold for $115 million, $105 million. I never could figure that one. He can't even get the eyes on they're both on the same side of the face. Anyway, can't argue with taste, but it sells for $150 million. Now, 20 years ago, the world record was set by a painting by Van Gogh, Portrait of Dr. Gachet, and it sold for $82.5 million. And that's the story I wanted to tell you. It was bought by a Japanese insurance company. In those years, Japanese had unlimited money. What did they do with the painting after they bought it? The answer is, this is a valuable painting. It cost $82.5 million. Well, of course, they created a gallery for it and a room. And inside that room, it was perfectly temperature controlled. Not too hot, that can hurt the painting. Not too cold, that can ruin the canvas. Not too wet, that could undermine and flake off. Not too dry. And why am I telling you all this? Well, the next time you go downtown in Boston in the cold winter on a snowy, thundering night and see a homeless man lying on the street, splashed by the mud of and the snow of the cars passing by, what do you know? What you know is that this image of God, which is infinitely valuable, is being treated like trash. And that's the measure of the dignity that should be as against the reality of the world that we live in. Next time you think of someone living on $1 a day or less, by the billions, you understand the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be. So the first dignity is infinite value. And the second dignity, again, says the Talmud, is equality. If you think about it, if I'm infinitely valuable, how can it be worth more than me anyway? But equality means there is no preferred image of God. Idolatry is to take a picture of Zeus, a picture of Astarte, doesn't matter, and to say this is what God really looks like, therefore it has a special dignity. God is not white and God is not black. God is not a male and God is not a female. God is not Jewish and God is not a Gentile. And therefore, if I recognize you as an image of God, I will recognize that instinctive equality. It evokes in me a respect for equality. It doesn't mean that I'm richer than you, I'm more powerful than you, I'm physically stronger. It doesn't matter. If I recognize the image of God, I immediately will detect and respect the equality of that person. That means before the law. It means, for example, tzedakah, a Jewish tradition. If I see someone who is poor and hungry, it's not a favor, it's not an act of charity, it's not an act of compassion, it's an obligation to transfer money from my pocket to this person. Why? Because if I recognize the intrinsic value of this person, which is being violated, if I recognize the equality which is not being sustained properly, then I feel emotionally an obligation. And if that equality is recognized as an obligation, it means not just to help. It means, for example, to know that when you help somebody else, they feel dependent and therefore, in that sense, made smaller. And therefore, the highest form of tzedakah, as Maimonides' famous line is to give a job, to enable development, to give a loan that enables a business. In short, the dignity of equality is not just a nice statement. It has consequences socially, economically, policy, and every other way. And the third dignity of an image of God, says the Talmud, is, and this is the uniqueness of the image of God. I'll quote the Talmud's language. When a human being creates many coins from one mold, Each mold is identical. Each coin is identical. If you have an airplane stamp with an upside-down flying Jenny, it's worth a lot of money because most airplane stamps come out identical. But an image of God, they're all created from one mold, Adam and Eve, and yet each one is unique and different. So the uniqueness is a fundamental dignity of every human being. That means morally the obligation not to see him as a stereotype. That means the obligation to recognize uniqueness means that even though my skin color is darker or yellower than yours, I don't automatically see that through a filter that makes it less equal, less valuable, less unique. When you've seen one, you haven't seen them all. That's the essential dignity that every human being is entitled to. The real revolutionary implications of this fundamental notion, I mean, if I had to summarize Judaism, I would say right there, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all human beings are created in the image of God, and they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable dignities, among which are infinite value, equality, and uniqueness. But that is not the full revolutionary implication of the statement. What the religion then goes on to say is, and this world, the one we live in, which violates and does not sustain, can and must be changed and will be transformed so that it honors and upholds each of these dignities for every human being. That's nothing less than that is what a paradise is about. And what does that mean? It means we'd have to overcome poverty. And I kid you not, of course, you'll say, I'm kidding you because it's not going to happen, but I kid you not, this is what the prophets say is what the Messianic age is all about. That's Judaism's main revolutionary principle. We'll overcome poverty because, frankly, as long as there's poverty, or we'll overcome hunger, which is a statement of the lack of value of another life. I think of the infinite value, and then I think of poverty. How about the UN study? It's less than a decade old, that year, in the third world, almost 6 million children died of various childhood and other diseases, which end in dysentery, diarrhea, dehydration, and death. And in which the study came to the conclusion, to keep them alive, what would it take? It would take clean water and 25 cents a day of oral rehydration tablets. But we live in a world in which 6 million died that year, children died that year, because no one either cared enough or raised the money or had the competence to provide 25 cents worth of oral rehydration tablets. Understand the gap in the reality that we live in. So again, the prophets say you don't yield to that, even though 90% of human history and of human beings have lived in that reality. It can and must be true. We'll overcome poverty. We'll overcome hunger. We'll overcome oppression. If equality is a fundamental dignity, then you don't give in to sexism. You don't give in to racism. You don't give in to anti-Semitism. I know they have extraordinary tenacity and power, but the answer is they are a violation of the fundamental dignity, and we can and should and must try to change the circumstances under this will be recognized and taken for granted. And if that's not enough, we'll overcome war. So help me, it's all in the book of prophets. In Isaiah, of course, they'll beat their swords into plowshares. They will learn war no more. Because how do you win a war? You wipe out infinitely valuable, unique people until you win. We'll overcome sickness, or at least that should be the goal. What robs uniqueness more than Alzheimer's? What robs me of my capacity and memory or ability to articulate my uniqueness more than a stroke? So the answer is these become central obligations, central ways of mission, central responsibilities. And of course, the more I talk, the more we all feel this enormous gap between these nice words and the reality of the world we live in. In reality, we recall, it's just less than 3 years old, the whole malaria, anti-malaria campaign. It turned out, of course, that to get mosquito netting, which would end malaria for millions of children in Africa, and it cost $8 for a net that lasts for 5 years. And again, they raised a lot of money compared to the past, including our government kicked in. But the bottom line is there are still millions of African and other children exposed to malaria because $8 for 5 years means less than half a penny a night. We're living in a world in which infinitely valuable, unique children die because no one is willing to raise a half a penny a night or create an economy that sustains that dignity. So the truth is, I think that is why it's the most important message. We're commanded not to accept, not to settle, but rather to have the courage of meeting the infinite value, meeting the uniqueness of the other person, seeing those people that we would raise in an environment that sheltered us. And in confronting that, admitting it, what do? You don't quit, you don't walk away. What do? Judaism says you commit. It's covenant. It's a commitment. It's a covenant in which you commit to Tikkun Olam. It means you commit, frankly, what are you asking for? Yes, you're committing your life. I'm committing my life because you'll never finish. The truth is you're committing beyond your life, but you commit your life. And again, it's a revolution if it's accomplished, but you can't accomplish it in one step. It's going to take one step at a time. You have to have tremendous respect for the people who are opposing you, respect for the people you're trying to help. You have to prevent paternalism or the temptation of revolutionary totalitarianism to wipe out the opposition so I can make the world better, right? But if you commit to this step by step and you commit your life, and frankly, when you get to the end of life, you realize I still haven't accomplished it, so you'll have to commit to raise your child or someone else's child or a society to take up that responsibility. You took it as far as you could go, and you will go. Now, I have to add one more comment from a Jewish personal perspective. For 1,000 years, Jews tried to live this in freedom, in independence. Most of the time, they were overshadowed by world empires that didn't do very well. But of course, they fell through all the errors and all the evils that most societies do. Read the Book of Prophets. All the problems of exploitation of the poor, all the problems of power, unfairness before the justice, all those issues. And after 1,000 years, when the Jewish community lost its homeland, went into exile for 2,000 years, again, it tried to live these values, but it frankly could not. When you are a pariah, when you're an outsider, when you're in a ghetto, when you were in battle and under siege, much of that energy went to preserving and saving your own self. Legitimately, absolutely legitimately so. And to some extent, in order to keep the dream alive, it was spiritualized. Tikkun Olam means in the cosmic realm, we may be marginal, we may be bystanders, we don't have an army, we don't have a government, but we have our spiritual force, and in the cosmic realm, in Kabbalah, we can shape God, we can make a Tikkun Olam, we can hold these values even though we can't practice them. And I would say to some extent that turned into some amount of insularity and self-concern and maybe even neglect or failure to see the rest of the world. And that's why, frankly, I was so electrified by encountering AJWS. It was an acknowledgement of the fact that in the last century, started, of course, with modernity and letting the Jews in for the first time to citizenship, to full participation. But in the last century, particularly in the United States of America and in Israel, two places where Jews have achieved not only equality, but opportunity to really create, to build a community, a society, to be part of a broader society, where it reached the point where there was enough security, enough margin of existence to be able to broaden and to reach out beyond myself and to meet all the other images of God, and particularly those that needed me, that were not being recognized, that were still being oppressed, that were still deprived of the fundamentals that every human being is entitled to. And again, I want to honor Larry and those who started AJWS, that there was a recognition. And to me, it's even more profound, because the truth is, Jews were first let out of the ghetto. Many Jews were so excited at the promise of the modern culture. Here's a chance to really transform, to overcome poverty, to overcome war, that they really felt they have to drop the Jewish identity and Jewish background to become responsible citizens of the world. Maybe some of that is the Jewish fault of having turned into it. Be as it may, so many felt the only way I can become a full participant in saving the world is to turn my back on my own roots, thereby, I think, depriving the world of one of the most important gifts and dignities, that of uniqueness, that a world in which there is not one international culture, but a variety of religions and a variety of moral examples and a variety of ethical challenges that interact with each other is an important part of that perfection. It's an important part of the creating an atmosphere of dignity and pluralism that is essential if we're going to have a world of equality and uniqueness. So here came Larry Simon and the people with him, and again I acknowledge all of them and appreciate them, to say, out of my root and out of my profound identity with my own past and my own experience and my own people's suffering and my own people's achievement, I want to recognize, uphold, sustain, and help create a world that will in fact develop enough to sustain. And again, in classic Jewish values, you're not just giving help, it's development help. It's the fact that in the end, a big part of dignity is that I can help myself, that I have an indigenous leadership, that I have my own cultural values that are also expressed as part of this growth and development. So it's a remarkable moment. And again, Tikkun Olam, it's not just social justice. Development means productivity, jobs, economic development, but one that doesn't lose the moral responsibility to recognize either its impact on creation itself or on my fellow human beings. It means equality before the law, equality in dignity, equality that grows out of the fact that I am able to support myself, the fact that I'm able to develop, maybe with your help, the kind of economy and the kind of social reality in which I express myself. And last but not least, the uniqueness dignity that comes in reaching out to people of every race, every color, every background. So I can only say it's not only a privilege to be part of this moment, but to say, as I reflect back on Larry's career, it's 40 years. It's 40 years. When he left AJWS, he went on with the same faithfulness, with the same covenantal commitment of a life to UN work, and then now to the Heller School and to the International Sustainable Development. That is not the least of his contributions and role models to all of us. Judaism, and I believe all religions and ethics, reflect the power of the intensity of the yearning to close that gap between a world where children and grown-ups languish for lack of pennies, to a world where they will have this access together. If you feel the yearning strongly enough, if you are driven enough by the encounter to awaken yourself, but to do that not in a year, not in a decade, to have the steadfastness to do it decade after decade, to have the steadfastness to realize that in the end, it probably will not happen in my lifetime either, but to have the courage to say you are not required to finish the work, but you are not free to start it. When I see this kind of steadfastness, it arouses my own hopes and fear that maybe the prophets weren't so crazy. Maybe they weren't quite as visionary as we think they are, to believe that we could create a world in which the lowly will be judged with equity, in which the hungry will be fed, in which the poor will not be second-class citizens. It's enough at least to arouse the hope to the point, I hope, of energizing us to try and go on further. Thank you.
You know, some of the students may not know that Rabbi Yitz was a teacher of Professor Simon. And to see these values of infinite dignity, equality, and uniqueness in every human being, it's quite striking that these values have been transmitted to Professor Simon, because that's exactly how he treats all of us as staff and colleagues and students. And so thank you, Rabbi Yitz, for your inspiring keynote. For our second speaker, it's a real delight to introduce a Brandeis graduate from the late 60s. Remarkable time, I'm sure, for the world, our country, and of course this campus. Joan Daston's journey will take us from her humble beginnings in Southern California to the East Coast here in Waltham, to Latin America, and to the far corners of the earth through her noteworthy work at the Ford Foundation. I've been really inspired as I've spent more and more time with Joan. It seems to me that Joan's encounters with diverse peoples, religions, and cultures, particularly in the fields of education and development, form a tapestry of her own personal values and life history. So please join me in welcoming Joan Dassin.
Thank you so much, Raj. It's a true pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you all for the invitation and the opportunity to be part of this very important event to honor Larry for his remarkable service. For me, this symposium is also a welcome opportunity to reflect on the meaning of compassionate action and service. For the past 40 years, I confess, also a few decades, I too have been engaged in activities that have led me to probably have more questions than answers. Where does the impulse to fight repression, eradicate poverty, redress discrimination, and reduce inequality originate? Moreover, what types of people shape and propel those struggles? And how can those of us who are committed on this journey to world development best support and train people who would be leaders in these movements? Is compassion, which I define as the active desire to alleviate another's suffering, the key motivating force for those who are drawn to service-oriented lives? If so, how should compassion or other equally important core values figure into development projects and programs, the stuff of our daily life? And I thought I would take the liberty here in a few minutes to address some of these questions by reflecting on my own life and career. The journey I want to share with you begins right here at Brandeis. As a Brandeis undergraduate in the late 1960s, I found many kindred spirits. My classmates included secular Jews who, like me, were raised in households where the Rosenbergs were a household name and where the excesses of McCarthyism were roundly denounced. My uncle, film director Jules Dassin, was blacklisted in Hollywood in the 1950s after refusing to testify before the infamous House on Un-American Activities Committee. Undaunted, he went on to become the famous French film director Jules Dassin, but that is another story. Of course, it was the 1960s, and the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement born of opposition to the war in Vietnam, and the incipient women's movement were exploding all around us. And only much later did I appreciate how well my Brandeis education had prepared me to understand how those social and political changes would shape our generation and our country. In fact, that early exposure to a wide range of writers, social thinkers, complemented by rigorous training in critical analysis, provided an educational foundation that has served me well ever since. What also shaped my thinking early on was my personal encounter with political repression. Like Larry, I've had a long involvement with Brazil. In the early 1970s, I went to São Paulo to conduct research for my doctoral dissertation, which was a historical study of Brazilian politics and culture in the 1930s. But it was the effects of the contemporary dictatorship that I saw firsthand. Called Os Anos de Chumbo, the years of lead. Those were years in Brazil when showing up late for a party left people convinced that the person in question might have disappeared, when intellectuals were kicked out of universities, and when writers and artists went underground or into exile. Workers and peasants had had few political rights to begin with, but labor unions and the famous peasant leagues of the Northeast were brutally dismantled to ensure that the military government's narrative of a triumphalist Brazil, winner of the World Cup in 1970, would prevail. And although I was never in danger personally, the 3 years I lived in Brazil during the height of that country's military dictatorship were a turning point in my life. Just as the Brazilians were slowly developing forms of resistance, especially in literature, the arts, and journalism, other countries in the region were falling to the same style of military dictatorship. Chile, where a military coup put an end to the Allende years in 1973, Uruguay, also in 1973, and Argentina a few years afterwards. The questions raised by these authoritarian regimes were dramatic. Why had progressive policies, especially land reform, led to such brutal repression? Why had the vision of a beneficent redistributive state turned into the reality of a nightmarish national security apparatus? Most perniciously for an American, What was the role of the United States in propelling these military regimes into power? And most crucial of all, what types of resistance would topple these abusive governments? I devoted many years to research, writing, and teaching on these questions in the United States and in Brazil. But my involvement went beyond the academic dimension. In the late 1970s, New York became a major center for Brazilian exiles. Even before habeas corpus had been restored in their country, the Brazilian exiles, writers, journalists, and politicians were planning a general amnesty campaign and their return home. They carried out these plans, and by the early 1980s, opposition governors had been elected in Rio, São Paulo, and Minas Gerais, three of Brazil's most populous and prosperous states. By 1985, the military regime had collapsed, opening the way for the restoration of civilian government. Similar changes, although for different reasons, were underway elsewhere in the region, with Chile the last to restore civilian government in 1992. During this period, I had the privilege of working with human rights activists throughout the region, both in a private capacity and with the Ford Foundation. And like Larry, I deeply admired the Catholic left in Brazil. At the request of Dom Paulo Evaristo Arns, who at that time was the Archbishop of São Paulo, and Jaime Wright, then head of the Presbyterian Church in Brazil, I edited the English edition of a book called Brasil Nunca Mais, or Brazil Never Again, which was the first book to publicly denounce torture in Brazil under the military regime. Quite uniquely, the book was based on transcripts of military trials in which political prisoners denounced the torture to which they had been subjected during interrogation. With the hubris typical of dictatorial regimes, the military took pride in the veracity of these records, little thinking that one day they would prove that the regime knowingly sanctioned torture as an instrument of state policy. Jaime Wright, an expatriate American and a nationalized Brazilian deeply committed to restoring human rights in Brazil, clandestinely copied thousands of pages of these records held in military court archives in Brasilia, right under the noses of the military government. Supported by the World Council of Churches, Jaime smuggled out copies of the documents for safekeeping in Geneva. Unfortunately, it was possible to produce the book in Brazil even before the military left power, leading to its publication in 1985, shortly after a new civilian president took office. I had the privilege of working on this project while teaching at the University of São Paulo. As a Fulbright scholar, I did not inform the consulate of my activities, I must say. The church-based and secular human rights movements that had played such a vital role in keeping dissent and dissenters alive during the dictatorship came forcefully out into the open in the mid to late 1980s. I joined the Ford Foundation in Brazil in 1988, just as human rights and other social activists were building new organizations that would lay the groundwork for a rebirth of civil society after the long nightmare of military dictatorship. In those years, modest amounts of foundation support enabled advocacy organizations of poor women, Afro-Brazilians, landless farmers, rubber tappers, indigenous people in the Amazon to participate in the public debate about a new democratic constitution that was being written at that time that would protect their most basic rights. My involvement in human rights work in Latin America and my proximity to the Ford Foundation during the 1980s and 1990s as it sought to help define the global human rights movement had a profound impact on my thought and action. I was especially drawn to the moral and political dimensions of transitional justice, efforts to hold perpetrators accountable while striking a proper balance between truth-seeking, accountability, and justice. These issues were fundamental both for human rights groups and government-supported truth commissions that forced societies to confront past abuses, but also chart a course toward reconciliation. They became relevant to many societies struggling to achieve nonviolent democratic transitions, most notably South Africa after the end of apartheid in 1994. Beyond that cluster of themes, I also gained a much more nuanced understanding of how civil and political rights are connected to economic and social rights. As democratization proceeded in Latin America, it became increasingly clear that regular elections, a civilian executive branch, and a military back in the barracks, as the phrase went, were necessary but insufficient conditions to create free and equal societies. The economic models that had been implanted by force under the military dictatorships remained largely in place, and the region retained its extreme contrast between rich and poor. The burden of poverty, exacerbated by the legacy of slavery and centuries of discrimination, continued to fall heavily on indigenous and Afro-descendant groups, especially women living in rural or urban peripheral areas. And even today, these groups are disproportionately poor and undereducated. How then would the deep structural issues of poverty, inequality, and discrimination that lie at the heart of sustainable development be addressed in Latin America or elsewhere? Over the years, I have come to believe that the people who are most directly affected by these problems have unique knowledge of oppressive conditions and an unmatched motivation to improve them. As Larry has said, the poor need to develop their own leadership. Development cannot succeed without indigenous leadership. That is a very important insight that led me to the next phase of my career and right back here to Brandeis. Over the past decade, Larry is director of the Sustainable International Development Program here at the Heller School, and his colleagues have provided an intellectual framework, specialized knowledge, and tools for social policy analysis for more than 150 fellows from our Ford Foundation International Fellowships Program, which we call IFP, which provides scholarships for graduate level studies to students from poor and marginalized communities throughout the developing world. The IFP fellows, who study a variety of development-related fields in universities around the world, were selected because of their leadership capacity and commitment to social change, as well as their academic records. And more of them, I'm proud to say, have attended Brandeis than any other private institution in the world. In our experience, SID and other Heller School programs, such as the MA in Coexistence and Conflict, are unique because of their interdisciplinary nature and the faculty's deep commitment to social action, as well as research and teaching. Indeed, the Heller School motto, and Lisa mentioned this, knowledge advancing social justice, could be our own. IFP has afforded me personally the opportunity of a lifetime to enable transformative social justice leaders to develop their skills and capacities. The philosophy behind the program is simple and is best expressed in its 3 pillars: learning, leadership, and commitment. Thus, the program sought talented people with academic capacity and a record of community service. Successful candidates for our program had to be scholars as well as activists. They would be steeped in their local context and culture, but willing to acquire new knowledge and perspectives. They would see the fellowship not as an opportunity for personal gain, but a way to advance the public good. Above all, they would come from marginalized and excluded communities, poor women, rural dwellers, ethnic and religious minorities, people with disabilities, that by definition did not have an interest in the status quo. On the contrary, they would see their future role as bringing positive change to their communities, but with the added benefit of advanced education and training. From the start, we saw this program, IFP, as a development project in its own right. Using the Foundation's network of country-based offices, we identified partner organizations that would adapt the program's global parameters to the local context and conditions. And by 2010, after a decade of operations, independent selection panels convened by these organizations had selected over 4,300 fellows from the developing world, really across the globe. But the interesting fact is that was actually less than 4% of the total candidates, well over 100,000 who had applied. How well did we do in realizing the program's vision of identifying social justice leaders from marginalized community? Just a few data will give you an indication. 50% of the fellows are women, over 80% are first-generation university students, and over 2/3 were born in rural areas or small towns. Virtually all of them come from communities that experience systematic discrimination in their home countries. In Brazil, for example, 95% of more than 300 fellows that we've selected are Afro-descendant or indigenous, and this in the largest African country outside of Africa, where blacks are still woefully underrepresented in higher education, and the first indigenous person in Brazil to obtain a doctoral degree is an IFP fellow. In Latin America more generally, 80% of over 1,000 fellows that we selected in 5 countries throughout the region are indigenous or Afro-descendant. What about academic success? After all, this is a program for graduate work, and would it be possible for these fellows to succeed in highly competitive academic programs? Here are the data. They're very positive. 97% of these 4,300 fellows have been admitted to over 600 universities in 50 countries. So they have been able to compete academically in a very rigorous environment. And more than 3,000 alumni who've completed the program, 98% of them concluded their fellowships in good academic standing, and 91% of them, including the doctoral fellows, earned their graduate degrees. And finally, and perhaps more importantly, and certainly most relevant to the theme of this symposium, what about the social justice goals of the program? Would the fellows, in fact, use the opportunity to pursue further training as a path to improve the public good rather than focus on their private gain? Would IFP inadvertently contribute to the dreaded brain drain, still a huge issue in Africa, for example? Not so. Approximately 82% of our 3,000 alumni are back in their home countries or regions, and 90% of those who have remained abroad are engaged in further study or professional training. Survey research shows us also that 90% of those who are at home are working and volunteering in education, health, agriculture, human rights, disaster relief, and a whole other set of strategic areas. So who are these fellows? Not a day passes when I fail to receive word of some extraordinary achievement, an award, an exhibition, international and national recognition. And nearly always these individual achievements stem from the fellows' efforts to transform their communities. I can't resist sharing at least one of their stories here. On a recent trip to Kenya, I had the pleasure of meeting Sakuda Nitoria, a fellow from the Maasai community, a traditional pastoralist people that still survive by grazing their cattle across the vast expanses of eastern Africa. Sakuda studied international relations in his home country at the United States International University in Nairobi because he didn't want to leave his home community for too long. I asked him what difference his studies had made. After all, wasn't he already working to empower women and girls among the Maasai? Quite unprompted, he said 2 important things. First, that his studies in international relations had made him a better diplomat and negotiator, prepared to face international donors. Second, under an IFP option called a sandwich program, an option available only to fellows studying in their home countries, Sakuda spent a semester at the State University of New York in Cortland, in upstate New York. During this stay, he learned about strategies employed by Native Americans to secure their land rights and earn income for their communities. It also enabled him to meet West Africans and learn about their approaches to community development. The fruits of Sakuda's new knowledge were readily visible when we visited him in his home country, home community about 150 kilometers outside of Nairobi late last year. By then, he had raised international and local funds to build several schools for girls and start a successful income generation project for Maasai women making and selling very stylish handmade leather handbags in shops in Nairobi. The women's profits were channeled straight into their daughters' education. Sakuda had also led the community in building shelters for young girls who otherwise would have been forced into early marriages. His standing as an educated man had allowed him to convince the conservative village elders that they could preserve their traditional ways, but also protect and educate their young women. The interconnectedness of these projects impressed me the most. For Sakuda, development is based much more than on the availability of funds. Rather, it requires a change in the community's views about women and girls, a recognition that they too must participate in improving everyone's standard of living. Apparently, the village elders agree. At their urging, Sakuda is running for governor of his region in the upcoming Kenyan elections, and he says he thinks he will win because the elders support him. The more difficult question, and here I'm heading into my final remarks, though to me, is what motivates the Sakudas of the world? Indeed, what has motivated my own journey in this service of world development? Larry has suggested that compassion is a key element. He posed the question as follows when I was exchanging some thoughts with him about these remarks. He said, well, what does all of this upbringing and experience mean for your understanding of compassion? I think, and here I'll venture my own opinion, that the basic impulse to try to improve the lot of others is deeply rooted in human nature. Some religious traditions may label this impulse or instinct as compassion, but it really seems to be present in all cultures. It may be repressed or debased, but it always resurfaces. I saw this so clearly in my experience with the Latin American dictatorships. No repression lasts forever. Sooner or later, courageous people dethrone even the most brutal dictators. Similarly, poverty deadens those caught in its grasp, but sooner or later, some people manage to break free. Among these individuals, those who act with true compassion and realize that cooperation with others vastly multiplies their strength and impact become transformational leaders. And as IFP, this program that I direct, demonstrates, there are thousands and perhaps millions of these leaders who exist in poor and marginalized communities throughout the world. The ultimate success of what Amartya Sen called development as freedom depends on their freedom of agency, which is determined, in Sen's words, by economic opportunities, political liberties, social powers, and the enabling conditions of good health, basic education, and the encouragement and cultivation of initiatives. For me personally, and I believe for many of the human rights activists and social justice leaders I have met over the past 40 years, it is precisely that freedom of agency that allows them to create innovative solutions to entrenched problems of poverty, ignorance, and disease. Compassion for others provides the impulse for change, but it is the freedom to imagine and act in new ways that brings change to life. I'll conclude with one more observation. What is broadly termed the aid industry, including international agencies, bilateral cooperation programs, and of course private foundations, has spent at least an estimated $2 trillion on development projects in poor countries. Yet poverty and social inequality persist, not only in the developing world, but also in our own country. The core values I have spoken about here, compassion, a focus on indigenous leadership, and the freedom of agency to imagine and act in new ways, rarely enter into development policy and practice. On the contrary, even private foundations are increasingly focused on measurable results and immediate impacts. This often leads to conventional, standardized approaches to project design and funding. Accountability for resources is necessary, of course, but freedom for people living closest to the problems they need to solve is more essential. Combined with compassion and courage, freedom, bolstered by health, education, and the other enabling conditions that Sen describes, leads to real breakthroughs in the service of world development. So Larry, I want to thank you for your compassion, creativity, and dedication to educating social justice leaders, as well as for the opportunity to participate in this important symposium. Thank you.
I think I can speak on behalf of Larry, Lisa, faculty, and staff. Joan, we want to thank you for the tremendous work you've done over the last decade in identifying really the Tikkun Olam is this infinite gift of diversity, which is our student body from the Ford Foundation's program. So we want to thank you. Our third speaker, I'll have to admit personally that in Rabbi Professor Mark Gopin, I can't say I've met a more interesting individual, having listened to their life story and their journey. And let me explain why very briefly. Thank you. Mixed up my sheet, so thank you for the distraction. Mark has had an abiding personal and scholarly interest in articulating principles of peace and justice, given the immense rabbinic resources that one finds in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and the history of Judaism. As Rabbi Yitz has attested, this is a private joy and a journey for anyone who undertakes the study of the Bible. But in Mark's case, over time, he came to apply these biblical principles in attempting to solve contemporary world problems particularly on conflict, coexistence, peace, justice, and furthermore. He is world-renowned for his path-breaking work in the Middle East. It is an honor to welcome Rabbi and Professor Mark Gopin.
It's wonderful to be here back in this building. I spent a lot of my life in this building, upstairs at Neges in the Judaica Library, because I did my PhD here in Jewish philosophy. I was so terrific as a graduate student that I think I quit the program 3 times and came back, so it took me a total of 10 years to do my PhD. And at the same time, I was a part-time rabbi here as part of the Hillel. So it's kind of a joy to be here, a place that my advisor of blessed memory, Marvin Fox, put up with me for all those years of my journey. And my journey was intimately connected in the long run, on the one hand with Neges and my journey of Jewish philosophy and my journey with Larry Simon. Life's journey is a mystery. It's just, it's incredible when you look back and you ask yourself, how did I get here? What were the ingredients that made things go this way? And I think it's still a mystery to me how I am, who I am today, and what I'm doing versus who I was. And so I want to go in reverse and just a couple of vignettes of where we are now in terms of the work that I've done. After I finished my degree in Jewish philosophy here, I moved on, and I eventually ended up, because I was already doing peace work when I was at Brandeis, but I moved more deeply into this work because of a chance opportunity to teach at George Mason University, and I developed a course on world religions and peace building, and it caught the attention of certain people and an institute on conflict analysis and resolution, and they became interested in me, not the professors, not the faculty, but the students. And then there was a whole network globally that I sort of fell into. And what happened was an interesting kind of activist and intellectual marriage of the field of world religions and religious ethics and a field called conflict analysis and resolution that never had anything to do with religion whatsoever. And in fact, much of academia found religion to be an objectionable discipline to be integrated with anything else. It's good for it to be its own little department. Even within those schools, theology schools and divinity schools have a hard time between world religions and theology. It's a very mixed up field, and always struggling with itself. I came out of that, and I came into this field of conflict resolution, and I was in search of something that was deeper and more practical in the world, that would face the details of how compassion really happens, of how justice really happens, of how peace really happens. Because the field of religious ethics was beautiful and sophisticated, and there was a wonderful integration of different schools of thought, from a Kantian approach to a utilitarian approach to a rules-based approach, social contract, many different approaches, moral sense theory, which was what my dissertation was on. But it hadn't come to a practice of intelligent compassion. And the reason I was searching for that was Larry Simon. See, something very strange happened to me in my journey, because I started out in a deeply, deeply religious world, highly, highly provincial, very cut off, very much damaged and wounded. Rabbi Greenberg is one of the foremost philosophers of Judaism today on Holocaust, and yet he didn't talk about it today. I'm going to talk about it. That's the irony of the exchange of roles. Because the Holocaust had an extraordinary effect on my family's life, even though we didn't lose direct relatives. But all my teachers were from the Holocaust. Everything about my life was living in the shadow of that event. And as I lived with this tormented contradiction between the Holocaust that said never ever again trust any non-Jew, Goyim, versus the teachings of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik that influenced both of us. We were both disciples. I grew up with Rabbi Soloveitchik, that insisted on universal values together with religiosity, that insisted on the value of every single life, insisted on human dignity. And that torment and contradiction was enough to drive you crazy. And indeed, torment and contradiction was an essential part of the existentialist philosophy that Rabbi Soloveitchik embraced. And truth be told, in the long history of Judaism, all the way from Jonah to Jeremiah to Woody Allen, torment is at the core of our personalities. Okay? It's at the core of living with contradiction, particularism and universalism, pessimism and suspicion and hope. And I grew up with both. And when I was 15 years old, something jolted me out of that world because I had just come from Israel, and I was 15, and I'd gone on my own because I said I was going to go on my own, and Gopins are bullheaded when they have an idea. And my parents let me. But then I just came back, and all the people I'd just seen at that kibbutz, they were all on the front because Israel had been attacked, and it could have been cut in two in 1973. And I was going to get on the plane, and I was going to get on the plane, and I was going to give my life. And the only thing that stopped me from getting on the plane was Rabbi Soloveitchik, because my parents called him in terror, and he called me over on Saturday, and he said, "You stay home," and that was it. But it was to that degree. And it was a picture on my wall about never again and never be surprised when they come for your children to put them in an oven. That was on my wall when I was growing up. I lived with this contradiction, but I got closer and closer to Rabbi Soloveitchik. Something was wrong in the early 80s. Because as Jews got more and more power, I sensed that the values that he was standing for were not being realized by Jewish empowerment, and that there was a distinction going on. I left YU not terribly happy. I came to Brandeis, and it was a breath of fresh air, but there was a torment in the fresh air, because the people who were expressing that intelligent compassion, that social justice with intelligence, were all secular, certainly not Orthodox. And I didn't know what to do with that contradiction. And suddenly my life began to change. And I searched and I searched. And one of the amazing things that happened as Larry and I bumped into each other, and I discovered, again, to be provincial, a Jewish brain, very secular, that was at the same time working out the details as if it was a deep Talmudic discourse on what the secrets were of human dignity on the planet. What were the secrets of compassion? What's false compassion and what's real compassion? What's true equality and what's false equality? How does it really happen? What's the magic that makes it work? Because I realize with Talmudic thinking, you have to drill down. You have to say, how are billions of dollars being spent on compassion and nothing's being done? Or more harm than good? How does that happen? And we drilled down, and Larry had just, I started out with him in AJWS. He left AJWS. I left with him on principle. It was the best decision of my life. And we proceeded to sit in Larry's living room, hours and hours and hours, working out the details of what real sustainable compassion is in the world. And I realized, I'll never forget, the first thing that we did is that we started our own organization, no money. I have a Jeremiah side to me. I get a rash around a lot of money and arrogance. It's just that prophetic side to my personality. And I became intrigued with how you can be transformative with very little money. And I'll never forget one thing that we did is that we spent $200 on an airplane ticket for Sajid Kamal, who's in the audience, to go and teach about a sustainable form of solar energy in a small village. And it was this electrifying moment for me, because it was a window. For me, it was a mystical moment, a Kabbalistic moment of the secrets of the universe. That the secrets of the universe, the secrets of compassion, were to be found not in $1 billion, but in $200, if it was based on relationships of depth and trust and equality and humility. And then the $200 needs to be scaled up to $1 billion if you ever want to have an impact on an entire country, of course. But first is that microcosmic moment. Is it a good moment or is it not? Is it a good relationship? Is it a relationship based on intelligent compassion, or is it an arrogant relationship? Is it a relationship based on force and imperialism, or is it a relationship of creativity and humility? And that's the secrets that I started to learn. Since then, everything changed, because I started to ask myself questions about, texts that nobody knows. Now I put them on Facebook. I have thousands of friends on Facebook because a lot of my work now is social network theory and practice on change through paradigm shifts of many, many young people thinking the same thoughts at the same time about particular issues like Iranian-Israeli relations or the Syrian opposition. And I work with the Syrian opposition. It's all about filtering messages that shift consciousness towards new directions of nonviolent resistance and so on. And so periodically I'll put on texts. Lately I've been putting on texts from the Talmud because I have we've developed these bridges. I have an deep Iranian relationship now. And I was told, to my shock just a few weeks ago, that I'm sitting with this person from Iran, incredibly intelligent, highly educated, brilliant dissident. And I said something about the Talmud, and he said, "Oh, I read the Talmud." I said, "No, you didn't." I said, no, I read it in school. I read it. I said, "It's impossible. It's 30 volumes in something that's never been translated into Farsi." I said, no, I read it. I'm telling you I read it. I said, it had this and this and that, and I said, "I'll take you to the library. That is a book that culled all of the worst things in the Talmud in order to teach in your school about Jews." And he just went into a state of mourning and shock when I realized that, when he realized that was a myth. And now this goes on all the time in the culture wars across the planet and the anger between the Muslim world and the West and so on and so forth. This was just one thing. So since then I've been putting on these texts from Talmud, and every time I'll just say, who is wise? He who learns from all human beings, Talmud. And I'll say, share it. People share it everywhere, and I keep going like that. But one of the texts that is the defining aspect of the conflict resolution experiments that I engaged in was Ezehu Gibor Ha'ose Es Sono Lo'ohavo. Who is the hero? Who is the strong man? The person who can make his enemy into his friend. What is power? And I started to see the connections. Oh, this is Ari Ratna. This is the Gandhian philosophy. This is what Larry had set me up with Ari Ratna, and we had a conversation on Judaism and compassion and Buddhism and compassion. And then this is the Dalai Lama speaking about what he learns from the Chinese. And I started to make all the connections. This is the Bible that says, if you see your enemy falling, help him. And the rabbis say to that, because if you help him, you'll put him into a state of shock. And he'll say, I thought he was my enemy, he's not. And then, the Deutsch's work on the plastic brain, the power of emotional intelligence, and the cognitive dissonance, the shock of changing things with one gesture that completely changes the neural pathways in the brain, particularly with habits. And I started to put the connections together. And so we do this. 7 years in Syria with my Syrian Christian partner. many years now with Palestinian partners. I'll never forget the time that I sat. Larry was always in the room with me. He's always in the back of my mind. I'm sitting with Arafat inches like this. And I got in through rabbinic subterfuge. I don't know how to put it any other way, but rabbis are what we call finaglers. And they just do things. They find ways. And somehow Arafat thought that I knew I was a personal friend of Bill Clinton's. I swear to God. I had a text. I had a letter from Bill Clinton, and anyways, he thought I was. And this rabbi in the West Bank, you know Froman, he used that letter to get us in, you know, and we're sitting together. It was the middle of the Intifada. It was very dangerous getting there. Many, many people had died. And I looked at him, and I kept on saying to myself, everyone created in the image of God. I was repeating mantras to myself because I was so scared, and I felt so guilty because it's somebody who had literally blown up women and Jewish women and children. And I'm sitting with them. I cried for a week afterwards. But I'm sitting in front of him, and I said, image of God, image of God, image of God. And then I just took from the Talmud and I said, you know, there's mourning going on here. They've just lost children. So I said, in my tradition, we have an obligation to comfort mourners. And I'd like to express my sorrow for all the Palestinian children that have died. So the room completely changed. And I knew that he, you know, because it was so different now. And I knew we had an opportunity, and that's why we were there. So I couldn't resist the prophetic moment, and I wanted, he's incredibly sharp. He listened to every single word. And I knew I had an opportunity to tell him a piece of my mind. A rabbi can't resist the time to tell a piece of their mind. And I said to him, you know, the Talmud says that without justice, there is no peace. And he knew by that I was saying to him, there's not enough justice here for you and your people. But the rabbi also says that where there is no peace, there'll never be justice. And he knew in that I was rebuking his terrorism. And at that point, he said something that he never said in Camp David to anyone. He said, I used to pray at the wall with the old Jewish men, holy place. And so he was making his gesture that in that moment that there was a meeting of the minds of the holiness of shared spaces, which is one of the keys to the conflict that has not been resolved until now. There are many, many other stories for Afghanistan. We just brought together 120 Afghan imams from every single province because of my Afghan partner and his indigenous knowledge, together with 20 of the leading Islamic scholars of the world who were terrified of those imams, and never before in history, with all the billions that were spent on corruption in Afghanistan, infighting and killing, never before had this donor finally made a space. And I'll conclude with this example, is that my field of conflict resolution, like many academic fields, becomes insulated. It's a danger of all academia, is that the longer it stays, the more insular it becomes. It'll be more self-generating and therefore somewhat less intelligent in the sense that it lacks that interdisciplinary richness. And my field started focusing much too much on the issue of conflict resolution and not enough on the issue of poverty and social change and equality above all else. It was my Palestinian partners. I run a center. It's an equal partnership of Palestinians and Jews together. It was my Palestinian partners that started to teach me that as good as the NGO world looked, when it's polarized, you have to look deeply, and you'll discover that people in those organizations that look like they're sharing power are not sharing power. That you have to look at the details. What are the salaries? Where are people's decisions? All of those things have to be looked at very, very carefully, and you can never see what the other group can see. And so it's a process of consultation where equality is the key goal of the empathy that you've brought to the table. And so we set up this partnership where, you know, in the Jewish-Palestinian relationship, as in many majority-minority relationships and power relationships, The people who have what they want peace, nonviolence, beautiful. The people who don't have what they want justice. You know, peace is very nice, but that's my home, you know, you're living in. What are you going to do about it? How are we going to live together? Where's the justice going to be? And so what we did was we created this model. It's an equal Jewish-Palestinian partnership, and we created a model that went past the NGO problems to a social entrepreneurship business that turns the profits of tourism and dual narrative tourism into fair wages in Palestine. And we're eventually in Sarajevo and many other places. We've gone to many other places. But the idea being that there's no way to conquer the issues of conflict resolution without the infusion of sustainability and equality in the model that you bring to that process. So, in many ways, I think my field should be named International Sustainable Conflict Resolution, as a good cousin to what Larry and so many other people have created here. In many ways, Larry's intellectual contribution to this field that you see in the personal story of myself and Larry Brilliant is similar to John Paul Lederach, an amazing Mennonite thinker on conflict resolution and practitioner, that all of us who've worked in the field completely upend these fields. We go from the bottom. We go from indigenous knowledge, indigenous wisdom, because the answers are there. And of course, Lederach, myself, we all have the same problem, and I'm sure you've seen this many times. You go there, and you're the one that's supposedly famous, and they say, no, we need your wisdom. And I say, no, I need your wisdom. And, you know, go back and forth on how you're going to elicit that wisdom because they think you're going to come with a formula. The greatest moment in the Afghan work was when the Afghan Advisory Council said, okay, what are we supposed to do? And turned around and said, no, you decide what to do. And they were in a state of shock because with all the billions of aid, no one had ever asked them that before. I learned all of this from Larry. And I don't talk to him about this very often because when you get a mission, going back to prophetic models, you go out and you do it. You don't talk about it, you don't agonize about it. I agonized enough in his living room in the 80s. Then it was time to just do. And it's been an amazing journey of discovering an intelligent approach to compassion that truly changes the world and mostly changes myself. When I think back to all the people, Iranian, Afghan, Syrian, Palestinian, that I've turned enemies into friends, really, I've turned myself into their friend when I was an enemy before. My latest book that's going to come out is on self-examination. And the key to this field, I think the key to all fields, in the end, is self-examination. Because if you know yourself well, if you work on it every day, if you know why you're enraged, if you know why you're prejudiced and tormented, if you know why you're wounded by the Holocaust, you can move on. You can move with your woundedness to become a redemptive spirit in the world. And that's the journey that that I was privileged to begin with Larry when I was very young. And that's all I'm going to say for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for a very insightful look into the tension I think that all of our speakers have spoken about and the redemptive quality that lies in their work. We're supposed to go till 4:30. I know a lot of you have bottled up a tremendous amount of questions. I have, only because I've been so inspired listening to our three speakers. But this portion is going to be about the respondents. I'm going to briefly introduce them. They're each going to take 10 minutes to respond. And if we have enough time, we might be able to have one or two questions. But please don't forget these questions. We're going to have an hour-and-a-half long reception where you'll have one-on-one time with each of the speakers and the respondents. So I promise you that there'll be a way to interact and for us to get into a larger discussion. But let's move to the respondents now, and then we, of course, are culminating to our finale, which is concluding remarks from Professor Simon. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first respondent, Ruth Messinger, President of the American Jewish World Service. She's a recognized leader in social justice issues locally and globally. Her work spans the treatment of genocide to poverty alleviation and development. Serving as an advisor to the Obama administration, Ruth's work as a notable leader bridges the worlds of ideas, policies, and politics. Our second respondent is Professor Andreas Teuber here at Brandeis and from Harvard. I can honestly say from one philosopher to another, I've never met a colleague in my discipline as interesting, eclectic, and idiosyncratic, but also as compassionate and selfless as Andreas. Andreas's mind is his heart, and vice versa. Both are so abundantly rich with unique ways to know and act in the world. So it's my pleasure to introduce Ruth Messinger, and then we'll hear from Andreas.
Thank you, Raj. Raj, my thank you to Brandeis. My thank you to Hillel. A special thank you to Mo Feldman. And I just want to note that there are two members of the American Jewish World Service board here, Don Abramson, who was on the board in its earliest days with Larry, and Barbara Dabkin, who is the current chair of the board. So we've heard a bunch of amazing stories, and Larry, it's really clear how people's lives were shaped by you, and in many ways how they've carried on your teaching and made a difference over time. Lisa said that Larry was a visionary founder, indeed, of American Jewish World Service, of an extraordinary graduate program. But what I took from the fact that this is a 40-year celebration and from the remarks that were made by Yitz Greenberg and by Joan and by Mark is the lesson that all of us need to remind ourselves of, and that is that none of this happens all at once, that it is those qualities of stick-to-itiveness, of sustainability, of steadfastness that really matter. And indeed, it was Justice Brandeis who said, and Larry, I think this applies pretty well to your last 40 years, most of the things worth doing in the world had been declared impossible before they were done. So where are we with that vision? So you heard a little bit about the living room. When Larry Simon started American Jewish World Service, he started small, in his home. That's true of almost all good initiatives, certainly of all non-governmental initiatives. But it was his commitment to do quality international development work from a Jewish perspective, through a Jewish lens with Jewish values, that has allowed us to grow as an organization, to build on that essential and early and initial commitment. So we are now, with the help of a huge number of people, some of whom I think are right here as part of this community, to a mighty organization. We're not at $1 billion yet, Mark, but we do have an annual budget of $50 million, so we're getting there. And what we do is, of course, act on the Jewish commitment to justice, work with and invest in civil society, and build capacity. We're now partners with 450 organizations in 30 different countries that are working toward the end of poverty and toward the expansion of human rights for the world's marginalized peoples. But also, and I think importantly for what we want everyone here to know and to do, we work not only in those countries, but we work in this country. But in this country, we work with people and organizations in the American Jewish community, this campus, other campuses, Hillels, congregations, not only to educate people in America about the state of the world, as important as that is, but to ask them, as these speakers so eloquently have indicated for themselves, as Larry Brilliant spoke for himself, to ask them to develop an acute sense of global responsibility, which is what the school is in so many ways all about, and then to mobilize them and organize them to work for social change, to address United States policies that continue to contribute to global inequality and injustice. But I want to say a word or two about how this work is best done. You heard several examples. We're talking about a cadre of people wherever they are, on our staff, in their own lives, in Brazil, in Syria, who go beyond compassion, who go beyond service for service sake to engaged action for social change. And for me, that's the critical word. It's action. Compassion matters, being of service and help matters, but it's action to make change. And what you heard, we all heard examples of here this afternoon, I think, is how do you act on that compassion in a fashion that really respects the other, that is really true to essential Jewish values? What you want to avoid is a kind of mushy concern and hand-wringing. What you want to avoid is a sort of sentimental collapse and over-identification, so that too many people in the international field assume that they so understand the plight of the other that they have all the answers. And we also want to go beyond what I find too often in too many places in contemporary society, and that is being overwhelmed. Oh, the problems are so large. I can't do anything about it. I would suggest to all of us that we do not have the luxury to retreat to being overwhelmed. We come from a culture, from a faith, from backgrounds that say over and over again, it doesn't matter unless we put our beliefs into action. With, as you heard from Yitz, with full respect for difference and distinction. As you heard from everybody, but perhaps dramatically from Mark and from Joan, listening to others, letting them set their agenda. What Yitz said there was treating them as equally made in the image of God, and therefore much more likely to know the answers to their own problems than does anybody sitting even in Waltham, in New York, at the UN, in Geneva. It's the people on the ground who set the agenda, and if we listen to them, then indeed, as Yitz said, we would in fact be building a world with no second-class citizens. So I wanted to do a quick commentary on another aspect of Larry's work that I think was not mentioned today. In addition to founding the organization that I'm privileged to run, in addition to founding graduate programs, Larry invented or brought to light or put together a silo that offered additional protection against grain spoilage. Why am I talking about that? Because think about this as the growth over, we're actually only 25 years old, Mark, 26 years old. Starting with a grain silo, American Jewish World Service today supports close to 100 grassroots programs that are about some aspect of agricultural sustainability. It may be the exchange of good seeds. It may be sharing lessons of crop rotation and drip irrigation. It may be creating a shared cereal bank, so a silo that serves lots of different groups. It may be, and it often is, fighting on issues of land rights and water rights. And we are now moving as an organization, I hope with the help and involvement of many of you, into protection against the United States policy of dumping grain in markets where, in fact, that grain undersells farmers and undermines all local programs for agricultural improvement. So it's the concern, it's the awareness that there are ways to make change, it's the understanding that the people on the ground very often have the answers. It's using those essential Jewish values to figure out what kind of change to make, who to listen to, who to work with, and to understand that that work has to be done over time. It's taking to heart the values of humility, of integrity, and of empathy. We're talking about what it means to take this up as a Jew, and I am privileged, thanks to my wonderful staff, to share with you something that I had never read before from a well-known Jewish scholar named Theodore Bickel. Lest my predilection toward my own Jewishness be misunderstood or misinterpreted, let me emphasize that I am a universalist, quite passionately devoted to the cause of equality within the human family. But I came by this attitude precisely because of the Jew in me. I think that's what Larry Simon has been telling the world. I remain convinced, said Bickel, that I can be a true universalist only when I am a better Jew. I perceive the world as a kaleidoscope The brighter each particle shines, the better for society as a whole, and certainly for each ethnic component of it. My particle, your particle, is the Jewish one. So when Yitz spoke before, he reminded us that we are not, I think it was Yitz, somebody spoke and said that we are not free to, we're not obligated to complete the task, but we're not free to refuse to participate. And those words are from our tradition, but I thought I would close by reading you what someone else said in a similar vein, someone who recognized that change occurs over time. These are the words of Archbishop Oscar Romero, very true to Larry Simon. We accomplish in our lifetime only a tiny fraction of the magnificent enterprise that is God's work. This is what we are about. We plant seeds that one day will grow. We water seeds already planted, knowing that they hold future promise. We lay foundations that will need further development. We may never see the end results, but that is the difference. We are prophets of a future not our own. Thank you. I want to just say totally irreverently that I make notes during presentations like this, and I'm always afraid that someone will look at my notes and think I've lost my mind, but his notes are wackier than mine.
One reason for their wackiness is then I can't read them. And then I just have to say what I think. Originally, I thought part of our job, Ruth's and mine, but especially mine, since I'm come here at the end and at a moment of transition, was to sort of find some connection with what everybody else was talking about here. And one of the things that struck me immediately, and remember, I've been trained as a philosopher, and one of the first things we get introduced to are ideas, and one of the things we spend lots of time with are words, was the connection between feeling and language, or feeling and big ideas. And I was actually terribly moved by this, and it's true of each and every one of the people here on the stage. There's a deep connection between what they feel and what they think and what they do. They seem to work from the inside out. And it actually seems to imply that life ain't worth living if you can't act from the inside out, not for an idea, but for something deep within. And we've just witnessed people who have really began, Joan herself talking about her upbringing and what she went through, the deep faith that Yitz has. He always came back to it. Every time he kind of got a little further or a little further out about what we might or might not do, back he came inside to the faith. And it's true of, and Mark ending on a note about self-examination, that it starts at home. There's a wonderful line in East Coker, one of the four quartets by T.S. Eliot, home is where one starts from. And I think it's really true here, and home here for the people here, and maybe it's a teaching and it's a lesson of sorts. It's a teaching about where do we go from here. They teach us something about where it might start, where you should start from. I have a cousin, who's married to Frank. Frank's her husband. After all, she's married to him. And he's Dutch. And a few years ago, he came to Boston because he has been running the Boston Marathon. And I'm the one person they know because I'm the cousin here in Boston. And they called first, and I picked him up at the airport. And the first thing he wanted to do is say, take me to the start line. He wanted to be driven the moment he touched ground to Hopkinton and to stand on the start line. We were here a day before the marathon, but then he knew, and then that was all he wanted. He didn't want to stick around or anything. He'd found the start line. He was okay. He was ready to go. And that seems to be partly here also, one of the teachings that each of the people bring to us here. This also brings me to think about what I might think of or want to say or be able to say about Larry, who I've really only got to know recently. But Larry, for me, is a special person, and you can tell from what the people here have been saying. Larry Brilliant talks about spending time with him and visiting him on one night, one day, and he thought he got more out of that visit with Larry than he got out of anything else that ever went on between them or any exchanges that they happened to have. So it's something about being in his presence. That I felt something very similar in seeing Larry. I felt something that I only know how to describe as a kind of being next to. I mean, I felt he didn't just on first meeting kind of completely embrace me. I mean, he let me be, stood to one side. And it reminded me of Thoreau, who speaks of not climbing all over the tree and wrapping your arms and legs around it and hugging it, but maybe just standing next to it and being there next to the tree. And it's the kind of thing often that little children really want and crave. Just be in the same room with me and just be present there. And Larry has that kind of capacity. One of the things that he does, it seems to me, and now I don't mean to change his gender, it's the sort of thing that good mothers do, which is he holds you. And because one feels held, one feels certain things that one really also craves: security, recognition, understanding. And all those three things seem to come out. And Joan's account of the program itself seems to be that that also expresses something about the program. The program holds you, holds its inhabitants, holds its people. And feeling held, they feel safe. And feeling safe, they feel also recognized and they feel understood. And then they seem ready and willing to take risks and to go out into the world. So the actual, there's this phrase we use, holding corporation. Well, it's a kind of, it's a holding corporation of sorts, but it actually, this gets back to feeling. It actually holds you, I mean, which is also incredibly striking. That's the sense you get, that there's actually a new thing going on here that doesn't really, we don't articulate in our own teaching. It used to be the method of teaching and the method of choice, especially in the medieval world, which is to go to somebody who actually already is doing the thing and then kind of learn by example. So if you were going to play the classical guitar, you would go find Segovia, and you just sort of sit there and then try to kind of do what Segovia is doing. Something like that may have happened with Larry Brilliant on that one night. I'm not absolutely sure, but something happened. I mean, just by being in the presence, it was a kind of exemplification that seemed to be taking place at that time. And to return to my own discipline just here at the very end, very briefly, I was also struck listening to the conversation about poverty and inequality. And it reminded me of Rousseau, because Rousseau was the first person, at least that I read, and it's someone who was noted for it, that connected feelings very strongly with ideas, and wrote at one point that one of the most terrible things about inequality is not so much its injustice, but its coldness, the coldness of those who are well off, as that takes place as they cut themselves further and further off from the poor, that the sympathies of the rich simply atrophy as they cut themselves further and further off from the poor. And so he particularly worries about compassion and where it's gone. And he thinks that inequality itself actually breeds a kind of loss of compassion because you no longer see yourself in the other or find it so easy to put yourself in their shoes. So if tenants and landlords get together to do a rent control law, landlords think they will never be tenants again. And so then they have their interests, and tenants will think, well, it's a long way to being a landlord. So there are these set of competing interests, and they argue, and they come up with some form of rule, but it's probably a compromise between their two competing interests. And it's maybe even a rule that neither side really wants, but they're ready to live with and be able to have. That seems to me, that struck me the most. Some of you may have been struck by other sorts of things about the conversation today. But coming from where I'm from, coming from what I do as a profession, I was absolutely struck by the connection between feeling and idea, between a deep-seated commitment to something and taking steps to do something about it, and always returning back to that original sort of feeling of commitment every time one's sort of resolve started to flag, and then coming from the inside out again. So I've learned a ton today, and I'm so grateful to the panelists, and we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Larry, so thank you.
Well, it looks like we have 15 minutes left. I'd like to proceed directly to the concluding remarks. I just want to echo what Andreas, Ruth, the entire panel said. What we've been sensing is that here's an individual, and Larry Brilliant as well attested to this. My first encounter with Larry was 6 years ago when he was on sabbatical at Stanford, and Larry Brilliant was absolutely right. When you meet the man for the first time, you meet an individual who has spent his entire life thinking very deeply and compassionately at the same time about the question of poverty and the experience of poverty, and then proceeded to lead a life to eradicate it in the world. So thank you, Larry. You changed my life, so I can only imagine how many other lives you've affected over the last 40 years. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Lawrence Simon.
This is becoming grossly embarrassing. But it's nice to listen to all the exaggeration, because it is exaggeration. You know that, guys. Anyway, thank you. But let me say in all honesty and without any kind of false modesty that there are really others on this panel and in this room who really are far more deserving of a symposium in their honor than I am. I really mean that quite sincerely. So I don't know quite why we're doing this, but I am grateful to all those who organized it. I'm also grateful to those who had the responsibility to put together the nitty-gritty of an event like this. You wouldn't realize how much detail there really is in this. And first I want to thank Mo Feldman, who's sitting here in the front row with his wonderful wife, Sue. Mo has really been, more than almost anyone else, been really my partner in building the Sustainable International Development Program here at the Hiller School at Brandeis. He's a businessman and one who is really, for me, a role model of one who has never diminished, despite his success in the business world, really never diminished a genuine humility and compassion. And along with Susan, I think, are really fine practitioners in Tikkun Olam. So thank you very much to both of you. And of course, our dean, Lisa Lynch. Yes, Lisa. Who first really suggested that there be a symposium, and I'm sure didn't quite realize what she was really getting herself into here. The months, literally months of planning. I'm deeply appreciative, Lisa, of your support for me over the years and for this day. And of course, our Heller staff that really worked very hard, Leslie Godoff and Faria Zaman, Ilana Marks Moses, Kara King Anderson, Ravi Lakshmi Kantan, and I'm sure others who took charge of the logistics for the event. And given the fact that we seem to have volunteers every 5 feet in the hall and through the campus, I can see the extraordinary organization that they brought to it. And my dear friend Larry Brilliant, whose life has really been a model of compassionate action and service. And Larry, if you're listening to the videotape of this in a few days when you get back from Antarctica, I only wish that even half of what you said about me was true. But I am going to give you a call. And Professors Roz Sampath and Andreas Teuber, and Andreas, my apologies for scooting out for just a moment while you began your speaking. They early on became the program committee, and so for this symposium, I'm very grateful. And of course, our speakers, Ruth Messenger, who's really a superb leader of the American Jewish World Service, and I can say, having been the first president, Ruth is the best president we've had. And Ruth, I want you to let me help continue building this organization from 50 million to that 1 billion mark. My old friend, Rabbi Mark Gopin, who you've heard from, whose own path to a compassionate embrace of the entire world has, in some respects, been, and he's described a little bit about it, been in some ways a painful journey away from his own origins. And Joan Dawson, who over the years has become a really dear friend and a leader of the Ford Foundation's work in Latin America, and who is the architect of the International Fellowship Program that she described so well, has really made what, in my opinion, is the single most important contribution to building leadership for equitable and just world development in at least the decade that it has been in existence, and probably long before that. And Yitz, Rabbi Irving Greenberg, one of the founding members of the board of AJWS, who is truly an historic figure. I think that phrase was used here today. An historic figure in modern Judaism, and a man that I've really been privileged to know for these years as a man of very deep and immense compassion and scholarship, and one I am sincerely honored to have called my own teacher and now my friend. And there are many in the audience that I should at least acknowledge, and perhaps some of them have already been. Provost Stephen Goldstein was to arrive. He may be in the audience here. Ronnie Zinner is here from the Brandeis Board and also the Heller Board of Overseers, and to whom I owe a great personal debt for her kindness during my late brother's illness. And Don Abramson, where are you, Don? Don is here, one of the original board members of AJWS, and assumed the chairmanship of the board during a very difficult transition in that organization's life, and very successful transition, I might add. And Joe Short and John Hammock, successive presidents of Oxfam America, and Bob Snow, one of my senior staff at AJWS and also worked together at Oxfam, and Barbara Thomas Slater from Clark University and formerly on the board of Oxfam, and Professor Irv Epstein, I think, is here someplace, who first hired me at Brandeis and supported my vision for the SID program. And of course, the First Lady of Brandeis, Dr. Kathy Lawrence. I want to thank all of you for coming today. As was mentioned, I grew up in a secular home. I think, Mark, you said something about a Jewish brain, and you probably meant in a secular body or something, but it's true. I grew up in a secular home, but with a father who could only be described as messianic. That was a word he would never have used, and certainly not as a description of himself. But he did have a messianic belief in the unfolding of history, in a progression toward a more perfect and humane world. His quest would not culminate in a personal redemption, but in an earthbound society in which every child, everywhere, would be equal, and where a universal morality would be embedded in every economic and social interchange. For my father, I could see now that morality and mortality were somehow interconnected. but not because morality would be a ticket to an immortal life. Morality and mortality were related somehow through the angst of the human condition, which either creates never-ending accumulation, inequality, and needless suffering, or it acts through compassion to heal the world, at least that part of the world's suffering that can be prevented or lessened. Both Rabbi Greenberg and Rabbi Gopin know that I have never been able to clothe myself in the mysticism of traditional religion. But Rabbi Greenberg once wrote that, and I'm quoting him, "It makes no essential difference if the Jews involved consciously articulate the covenantal hope or express a belief in the God who is the ground of the covenant. The witness," Rabbi Greenberg said, "is given by their actions. If anything, their denials only add to the hiddenness of the divine." Even I can accept that. I do know, Rabbi, that the only time that I feel truly alive, truly connected to something transcendent, something greater than the self, freed of all the baggage of our lives, is when I am in direct relationship to those suffering the indignities of poverty, when I witness the obligatory meekness of the powerless, witness the sadness of not being able to provide a life of learning and happiness for their children, or even guarantee their survival. This relationship for me, following Martin Buber, has on occasion taken me above the I-it of everyday experience and into the realm of ich und du, the I-thou, which even in my secular garb I have experienced as massively compelling, life-changing, and deeply moving. And that transcendence is channeled into a life of service. I'm not alone in that by any means, and I have seen so many others who have chosen a life of solidarity with the poor, who much more than I have live amongst them and help them to achieve a fuller life. In later years, I began to probe a little bit more deeply into the feeling of compassion. I suspected even in youth that it was on the fringe of mystical union. But our speakers know that I have avoided all kinds of orthodoxy and institutional religion. Yet I now believe that my earliest experiences in the realm of compassion were the stirrings of perhaps a personal religion, rooted in my Judaism. Not a religion of redemption and eternal life for me, but one that at least makes tolerable what Bertrand Russell once called the terrible isolation of the human soul. So here are 3 stories. I like to tell stories in my classes. So here are 3 stories for you, very brief, about compassion as meditation, compassion as moral guidance, and compassion as social justice. So number 1, compassion as meditation. A few years ago, I met Mr. Joseph sitting on the banks of the Mississippi River. Illiterate, dressed in the stained clothing of an agricultural laborer on a Mississippi Delta plantation, a descendant of slaves, never traveled more than 20 miles from home, almost killed in a fire that was started when he was drunk. But Mr. Joseph tells me that he sits on the banks of the great river and feels a loving kindness toward all creation. He sends his love out like waves to all who pass by. Like the metta meditation of Buddhist practice, Mr. Joseph sits for long hours sending his love out to friend and foe, to those he knows, and especially to strangers like me passing by. And in the most surprising and moving part of his narrative, he sends his love to the trees, to the birds, to the sky, and to the clouds. His is a universal compassion for all creation. Number 2, compassion as moral guidance. When I was a young graduate student, I studied philosophy at the New School for Social Research in New York. Even by then, 1970, some of the great European scholars who had fled the Nazis were still teaching there. The phenomenologist Aaron Gurvitch, the Gnostic scholar Hans Jonas, and the political theorist Hannah Arendt. Professor Arendt once told of being close to two families in Germany at the outbreak of the Second World War. Both were Christian families. One family lived in Berlin, was very well-to-do, and whose sons represented the heights of German education and culture. The other was a farm family who lived a simple existence and whose sons left school early to work on the farm. The Nazis drafted both sets of sons to serve in the army. The educated and cultured sons of Berlin went willingly, despite seeing the sharp edge of the Nazi machine against the Jews. The sons from the farm hesitated and ultimately refused to serve because they felt for those Jews being taken from their homes. They were sent to prison and died there. Number 3, compassion as social justice. The Archbishop of Recife, Brazil, Dom Helder Câmara, once engaged in dialogue with Mother Teresa that I heard, who had just given a talk about her work in the slums of Calcutta. Helder Câmara praised her for caring for the sick and the dying, but in his usual way, he also chastised her, very gently, for to Helder Câmara, true compassion must lead to understanding and to challenging the underlying causation of sickness and death that spring from poverty and social degradation. For Helder Câmara, who had a profound influence on me when I was young, poverty was the worst form of violence. And as the papal encyclicals on social teaching magnificently articulate, the work of society must always be toward greater humanization for all. But that is sometimes dangerous. Helder Câmara, during the long years of military repression in Brazil that Joan spoke about, was targeted for assassination. In words that would ring true in many parts of the world today, he once said, "When I feed the hungry, they call me a saint. But when I ask why they are hungry, they call me subversive." In the Jewish tradition, Maimonides teaches, anticipate charity by preventing poverty. And he went on, this is the highest step and the summit of charity's golden ladder. So from these stories, I've tried to understand something of the nature of compassion. First, I think compassion is more feeling than intellect. It does not spring from education. Mr. Joseph of Mississippi had no schooling, never read Kierkegaard or Hegel or African novelists or Sufi poets. He came to the world through deep suffering, through personal redemption, and came to a place of the purest compassion. Secondly, compassion has a noetic quality, similar to the way William James described mysticism. James said, they are states of insight into depths of truth unplumbed by the discursive intellect. This actually tortured Hannah Arendt, for her beloved Heidegger, despite his luminous writings, had within him the seeds of a fascism that denied compassion. Thirdly, the question of compassion, as for Helder Câmara of Brazil, leads to the consideration, the necessary consideration of its praxis. Mr. Joseph seemed powerless to act upon his world unless meditation or prayer can be said to heal the world. Maybe he was a hidden saint or one of the 36 just men of our age, victimized and humbled by the weight of the world into which he was born. For the German youths who went to their death rather than deny their compassion, their praxis was an intensely personal one, more an act of moral courage than of intervention. But it is Helder Câmara and Oscar Romero, who Ruth mentioned, who knew that only in the investigation of the causes of suffering, of poverty, of preventable illness, of oppression, can compassion find its true praxis. If compassion is not to dissolve into mere sentimentality or empty activism or feel-good gestures, it needs to be all of the above, a meditation, a moral guide, and thoughtful, concrete acts toward social justice. That, for me, is Tikkun Olam, and that is a covenant, Rabbi, that I can accept. So thank you very much for this honor, and I hope you will now join us for some refreshments in the back. Thank you.